The supper service at Ashvale Park ran to 11 removes on the night of Lord Harwick's birthday dinner, and not one of the 30 guests seated in the long dining room would have noticed the girl clearing the wine glasses at the sideboard. That was, after all, the nature of her station. Nora Finch had learned, in the 2 years she had spent in service at Ashvale, that the way to make herself useful was to make herself invisible. She moved through the great house like weather, present enough to accomplish what was required and absent enough to be forgotten the moment the task was done. She was 22 years old, and plain in the way of women who have been working since girlhood, her hands reddened at the knuckle, her dark hair pinned so tightly beneath her cap that the gesture of smoothing it had become reflex. She wore black, as all the lower housemaids did at formal occasions. The color suited invisibility. The Duke of Ashvale sat at the head of his table as he always sat, still and contained, with the particular quality of stillness that had always unsettled Nora slightly. Because it was not indifference. It was the opposite of indifference. His eyes moved across his guests with a precision that reminded her, absurdly, of a man reading a room the way a scholar reads a text, taking inventory without revealing what he found. He was 34 years old, dark-haired, broad through the shoulder. And in the 2 years she had been at Ashvale, she had learned that his silences were not coldness, but calculation. Though she could not have said how she knew this, only that the house had taught it to her by degrees. She was reaching for a half-empty claret glass when she heard the voice from behind the service passage door. The door stood a quarter-inch ajar, no more, and the corridor beyond was dark. She would not have paused at all had the voice not spoken the Duke's name in a register so deliberately low that her hands went still of their own accord. "Ashvale keeps a physician on the estate," the voice said. "Convenient for us, on reflection. A man his age, under that kind of strain, the heart does unpredictable things." A second voice, lighter, with the faint lilt of someone who had spent years in the city before settling into the country. "You are very certain the powder will not be traced. The physician will trace nothing he is not paid to trace." Nora set the glass down without a sound. Her pulse was loud in her throat. She did not look up at the table, did not allow her face to change. She reached for the next glass in the rotation and moved 2 steps to the right, the way she always moved, steady and purposeless as furniture. She did not know whose voices those were. She had not recognized either of them clearly. She had heard enough. If you have ever carried a secret that no one will believe, you know the shape of what settled over Nora Finch in that moment. Not panic, but a kind of terrible clarity, cold and precise as a January morning. Stay with her, if you will. The dinner concluded at 11:30. Nora cleared the last of the dessert service, carried a stack of plates to the scullery, and stood at the stone basin for 3 minutes, her hands submerged in cooling water, working through what she knew. What she knew was almost nothing. 2 men unidentified, a powder. The Duke's physician, whose name was Mr. Collard, a slope-shouldered man of 50 who had come to the estate with the previous Duke and who smiled too readily at the wrong sort of people. The word traced. What she did not know was everything else, and she stopped herself at the word because she knew better than to use it carelessly. She did not know who. She did not know when or by what method. She did not know, most importantly, who in this house she could safely tell. She thought of Mrs. Ames, the housekeeper, who had the ear of the upper staff, and who had always treated Nora with a measured fairness. Mrs. Ames would hear her out. And then Mrs. Ames would remind her, with that same measured fairness, that a housemaid's testimony against unnamed gentlemen, on the basis of a conversation heard through a crack in a service door, was not testimony at all. It was rumor, and rumor from that quarter was a swift road to dismissal. She thought of the butler, Mr. Slade, and discarded the idea before it had fully formed. She dried her hands on the linen hanging at the basin. She had to tell someone who would act on what she said. And she knew, with a clarity she could not have fully explained, that the only person in this house with both the authority and the inclination to act was the man sitting at the head of the table she had just finished clearing. She had spoken to the Duke of Ashvale precisely 4 times in 2 years. Once when she had found his leather-bound journal left on the library window seat and returned it to his study. Once when she had misread a corridor and entered a room he was occupying. Once when she had been called to his study to account for a broken porcelain piece that turned out not to have been her fault. And once, the strangest of the 4, when she had been carrying a nursery tray along the east corridor, and he had come upon her from behind, moving fast, and caught the tray with both hands when she stumbled on the loose floorboard rather than let it fall. He had not scolded her. He had set the tray straight and walked on without a word. It was the kind of thing a person did without thinking, and it had lodged in her memory like a splinter, small and persistent. She did not go to him that night. She went at 6 o'clock the following morning, before the house was properly awake, with the knowledge that the kitchen staff would cover for her absence from the breakfast service for perhaps 20 minutes before questions were asked. She knocked at the study door. He said, "Come in a voice that told her he had already been at his desk for some time. The room smelled of wood smoke and old paper. He was seated behind his desk in his dressing gown and coat, a letter open before him, and he looked up when she entered with that precise, taking inventory look she recognized. His eyes did not register surprise exactly, but something recalculated itself behind them. "Miss Finch," he said. She had not known he knew her name. The surprise must have crossed her face, because something in his expression adjusted almost imperceptibly. "Sit down," he said. She did not sit. "Your Grace, I beg your pardon for coming at this hour. I heard something last evening that I believe you should know. I am aware that my word alone is not much to stand on. I am telling you nonetheless, because I believe the alternative to telling you is worse." She told him in plain sentences, the way she had rehearsed it at the scullery basin. The passage door, the 2 voices, the physician's name, the word powder, the phrase "the heart does unpredictable things." She did not embellish. She did not speculate. When she had finished, she folded her hands in front of her and waited. He was very still. "You did not recognize either voice," he said. "No, Your Grace, the first was a gentleman. The second also, I think, though I cannot be certain. And you came to me before going to Mrs. Ames." It was not a question exactly. She answered it anyway. "Yes, Your Grace." "Why?" She considered the truthful answer and gave it. "Because Mrs. Ames would have told me I was mistaken." A silence. The fire settled in its grate. Outside the study windows the morning was gray and still, the park just beginning to separate itself from the darkness. "You will tell no one else," he said at last, his voice level, the words carrying the weight of instruction rather than request. "You will carry on with your duties as though this conversation did not occur. If you see or hear anything further, you will find a way to tell me directly. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Thank you, Miss Finch." She was at the door before she heard him add, quietly, as though to himself, rather than to her, "You were right to come." She did not look back. She closed the door behind her and stood in the corridor for 2 full breaths before her legs remembered how to carry her. In the days that followed, Ashvale Park became a different kind of place beneath its ordinary surface. Nora noticed things she had not allowed herself to notice before. The way Mr. Collard took his supper in the upper servants' hall with a deliberate affability that struck her now as rehearsed, the way a certain Lord Fenwick, one of the Duke's oldest acquaintances, and a guest who had stayed on after the birthday dinner, spent a great deal of time in company with a man named Darwell, who was the solicitor handling the contested portion of the Ashvale Estate Trust. She did not know what the trust involved. She had heard the word entail spoken in low voices in the corridors enough times to understand that something was unresolved, that there were parties with a material interest in the Duke's health failing before a particular legal date. She observed all of this. She carried her trays. She changed her linens. She was invisible. There was a particular discipline to being invisible that she had never once thought to resent until now. It had always seemed to her a reasonable trade, the kind of calculation a person of her situation learned to make without argument. The work was steady, the house was warm enough, the meals were regular, and the alternative was the kind of scraping uncertainty her mother had lived through at the end of her father's illness, and which Nora had watched hollow her out in the space of a year. Invisibility was not indignity. It was shelter. She had told herself this with reasonable conviction for 2 full years. Now she found that the conviction had shifted. Not because anything had changed in her circumstances, but because someone had looked directly at her in a room and not looked away, and the particular quality of that looking had done something she could not undo. She did not examine it. She put it where she put everything she could not yet afford to examine, in the careful drawer of the mind where good sense and good judgment and the long view all lived, and she closed it. On the 4th day, she saw Lord Fenwick pass a folded paper to Mr. Collard in the lower corridor, in the brief window between the physician's morning rounds and the household's morning assembly. She was around the corner, carrying a stack of pressed table linens, and she did not alter her pace or her posture. She filed the image away with the same careful, unhurried attention she brought to every task. That evening she left a note beneath the Duke's study door with one plain line. Lord Fenwick passed a paper to Mr. Collard at 8:30 this morning in the lower east corridor. She did not sign it. He would know. She found, to her own surprise, that she was not frightened. She was something more difficult to name, a state of heightened and precise attention, the kind of focus that comes when a person has decided to do a thing fully, or not at all. She had carried this knowledge for 4 days now, and in that carrying she had understood something she had not expected to understand. The Duke of Ashvale did not dismiss things without examining them first. Whatever he was doing in response to what she had told him, he was doing it carefully and without apparent movement. She had worked in a house long enough to know the difference between a man who had forgotten what he was told and a man who was quietly building something. She trusted, against all reasonable evidence of her own station, that he was the latter. On the 6th day, Mrs. Ames called her into the linen room. "You have been distracted this week," Mrs. Ames said. It was not an accusation. Mrs. Ames dealt in observations. "I beg your pardon, Mrs. Ames. The upstairs morning rooms have been done adequately, not to your usual standard. I will take more care." Mrs. Ames looked at her for a moment with the evaluating thoroughness of a woman who had managed a large household for 20 years. "Lord Fenwick's valet mentioned that you were in the lower east corridor on Tuesday morning, at 8:30. The floor did not shift beneath Nora's feet, though it had reason to. She met Mrs. Ames's eyes with the steadiness she had been practicing since she was 14 years old, and first understood that a poor girl's composure was the only coin she would ever reliably possess. "I was delivering linens to the east guest rooms," Nora said, "as my schedule requires." Another moment. Then Mrs. Ames said, with care, "You are a sensible girl, Nora Finch. I have always found you so." "Thank you, Mrs. Ames." "Be careful." The words were so quiet that Nora almost missed them. She held them for the rest of the afternoon, turning them over, trying to understand what they meant, and from what quarter the warning came. She did not sleep easily that night. She lay in the narrow bed in the upper housemaid's room and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her, the distant percussion of the stable clock, the wind pushing at the loose casement above the east staircase. She had been in this house long enough to know its sounds as well as she had ever known any sounds, and they should have been, as they always were, a species of comfort. They were not that night. She turned the problem the way she turned everything she could not resolve quickly, examining its edges for the place where it was weakest, for the question she had not yet thought to ask. Lord Fenwick's valet had noted her presence in the corridor. He had reported it to someone, presumably Fenwick, and Fenwick or someone acting for him had ensured that Mrs. Ames knew. The chain of information was short and deliberate. They were telling her, without telling her, that she had been seen and that she should consider carefully whether she wished to remain visible. It was, she thought, almost admirably concise. No threat, no confrontation. Only the fact of her visibility, placed before her like a choice. She thought of the Duke's level voice. You may have difficulty in the coming days. She thought of the quiet authority of it, the way it had landed not as warning, but as preparation. The difference between those two things being, she thought, the difference between a person who expected her to fail and a person who expected her to manage. She would manage. The following afternoon, she was called to the Duke's study again. He was standing when she entered, which she had not expected, and there was a second man in the room whom she did not know. A lean-faced gentleman of 50 or so in a dark coat who introduced himself as Mr. Hewell of the Inner Temple. The name meant nothing to her, but the coat and the manner both suggested a species of authority that operated quietly and at depth. "Miss Finch," the Duke said, "Mr. Hewell would like to ask you some questions about what you observed on Tuesday morning. You may answer him directly." She did. Mr. Hewell asked precise questions and made no reaction visible when she answered them. He asked her twice to repeat the exact time, to describe the location of both men within the corridor, to state whether Collard had spoken after receiving the paper. When she said she could not confirm that he had spoken, only that he had tucked the paper inside his coat and turned back toward the east wing, Mr. Hewell made a brief note and said, "That will do." After he had left the room, the Duke remained standing at the window, his back partly to her, the gray morning light falling across his coat. "You may have difficulty in the coming days," he said. "If anyone questions you regarding your movements, you are to say that you were completing your ordinary duties. Nothing more." "I understand. I am also taking steps to ensure that your position here is not challenged on this account." She absorbed this without showing that it reached her. He turned from the window then and looked at her directly, with the full weight of that taking inventory look she had never been on the receiving end of for more than a glancing moment. Something in his expression was different from the careful, level authority she had seen in that first morning interview. There was, beneath the composure, something that cost him more to hold. "You were not believed," he said, "by the people you expected to tell before coming to me." "I did not try them, because you anticipated correctly what their answer would be." She looked at him steadily. "Yes, Your Grace." "That particular anticipation," he said, and paused, "is not new to you." It was such a precise thing to say, not a question, not a statement entirely either. He was naming something she had never said aloud, the accumulated arithmetic of her years in service. The 1,000 small calculations a woman of her station learned to perform before speaking or acting, each one factoring in the cost of not being believed. She had been doing it so long, she had stopped seeing it as anything other than ordinary. She did not answer, because there was nothing to answer that would not give too much away. He looked at her for one moment more. Then he said quietly, "Sit down, Miss Finch." And this time, she did. She told him the rest of it, the things she had stored but not yet delivered, in a voice she kept carefully level. The too smooth affability of Collard at supper. The pattern of Fenwick's movements through the public rooms. The word entail heard twice in the lower corridor in the past fortnight. He listened without interrupting, and when she had finished, he asked 3 questions, each narrower than the one before, each finding the precise point where her evidence was strongest. She understood, watching him work, that he was not a cold man. He was a man who had learned to keep everything behind a particular face because something had happened that made the alternative, the unguarded face and open expression and visible response, too costly to risk. She did not know what the thing was. She could feel its shape in the room, the way a missing weight changes a balance. She was out of her depth and knew it, and sat still. After she left the study that day, she went directly to the kitchen and began the afternoon service, and she did not allow herself to think about the quality of attention he had given her, or the strange accuracy of the things he had said, or the warmth she had felt at the base of her sternum for the remainder of the afternoon. She was a housemaid. He was the Duke of Ashvale. There were no further categories. The matter came to its conclusion 9 days after the birthday dinner, in a manner Nora did not witness directly. She pieced it together later, from the fragments that moved through the lower staff, filtered and adjusted by the time they reached her. Mr. Hewell of the Inner Temple had arrived at Ashvale on the morning of the 9th day with 2 other men, one of whom was a king's officer. Mr. Collard had been removed from the estate by mid-morning. Lord Fenwick had departed Ashvale the previous evening, a fact which several members of the upper staff noted with the carefully neutral expressions of people who had been told not to discuss it. The solicitor Darwell had not been seen since Tuesday. The powder, whatever it had been, and Nora never learned its name, had been found in Collard's medical case. This she heard from the second laundry girl, who had heard it from the Duke's valet, who had heard it from Mr. Hewell's man, in the descending chain of confidence by which everything in a great house eventually became common knowledge below stairs. The matter of the trust, the entail, and the precise legal stake that had made the Duke's continued health inconvenient for certain parties. This, too, she learned in fragments, across the following week. And none of the fragments surprised her. She had understood the shape of it without knowing the specifics. Some men measured their futures in their own advancement. When another man's existence blocked that measurement, the calculation became simple and brutal. She was changing the linens in the upper west corridor when she heard footsteps behind her and turned. He was alone, without his valet, which was unusual at this hour. "Miss Finch," he said. She straightened. "Your Grace, I wish to tell you myself that the matter has been resolved. You will have no further difficulty on account of it." "I am glad of it, Your Grace." A pause. "I am glad you are well." Something crossed his expression, very quickly, that she did not have a name for. Then he said, "I have recommended to Mrs. Ames that your wages be reviewed. The housekeeper agrees that your work merits it. That is very generous." "It is not generosity." His voice was level, almost careful. "It is accuracy." She looked at him then, directly, which she would not ordinarily have done, because there was something in the word accuracy that she recognized from her own vocabulary, from the particular way she had always thought about what she did and what it was worth. He was looking at her in return. In the corridor, in the ordinary morning light, with the stack of clean linen in her arms and her cap pinned too tightly as always, she felt the warmth return to the base of her sternum and did not allow herself to name it or act on it or acknowledge it in any way that could be observed. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. He held her gaze for a moment that was slightly too long for courtesy. Then he said, in a voice that was quieter than the one he had been using, "You were not mistaken, Miss Finch, in anything." He walked on. She stood in the corridor for 5 complete breaths before she was able to move her hands. In the weeks that followed, the great house rearranged itself around the absence of what had nearly happened. There is a quality to the autumn at Ashvale that she had noticed in her first year of service and never stopped noticing. The way the oaks along the drive turned slowly from green to bronze, to a particular shade of copper that existed nowhere else she had ever seen, and the way the light in the late afternoons fell through those colored leaves onto the stone of the east wing and made the house look, for an hour each day, as though it were on fire from the inside, but warmly, like something being kept rather than consumed. She was carrying a breakfast tray through the east corridor on a morning in October when she found the Duke standing at the window at the corridor's end, looking out at the park. He did not seem to hear her approach. She had taken 2 steps past him toward the east sitting room when he spoke. "Miss Finch." She stopped, turned. He was still looking at the window. The light was on his face, and his expression was the one she had no name for, the one that had cost him something. "My wife," he said, "died 4 years ago. She was unwell for a long time before she died, and I was not good company during that period. I was told this by several people I trusted, and I believed them. And I have not found a reason to doubt their accounting since." She stood very still. The breakfast tray was warm through the linen. "I tell you this," he said, "because I find myself unable to account for what I am about to say, without first accounting for what came before it." He turned from the window then. "I have spent 3 weeks trying to determine whether what I have observed in you is the ordinary quality of an honest person, or something specific to you. And I have concluded that the distinction is not as useful as I initially believed, because there are almost no honest people, and you are, in fact, specific to yourself." She looked at him. Her pulse was audible to herself. She kept her face quiet by an act of will she would not have been able to explain to anyone. "I am not able to offer you a courtship in the ordinary sense," he said. "There are considerations of station which I will not pretend do not exist. I am also aware that what I am about to propose may strike you as sudden, or strange, or presumptuous, and that you are entirely at liberty to decline it." "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. "I would like to know you better," he said. "I would like to be permitted to know you better. That is all I am asking, for the present." The breakfast tray was cooling in her hands. The light through the corridor window was the October copper she had always loved, laying itself across the stone floor in long, warm bars. She thought of Mrs. Ames saying, "Be careful," in a voice that had not quite sounded like a warning. She thought of Mr. Hewell asking his precise questions, and of the Duke listening, in that first morning interview, with the full weight of his attention, as though what she said mattered to the outcome of something real. She thought of those words, exact and unadorned. "You were not mistaken, Miss Finch, in anything." "I would like that also," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Something behind the careful face shifted the way a river shifts in early spring, not breaking the ice, but loosening its hold. "Good," he said, in a voice that was very quiet. "Thank you." She carried the breakfast tray onto the east sitting room, set it down, and stood at the window for a moment looking at the park, the copper oaks, the gray stone of the far wall. She did not allow herself to feel any of it fully until she was alone. What followed was not a courtship in the ordinary sense, as he had said, and she held that phrase as a kind of key to the weeks that came after it. He invited her, through Mrs. Ames, to bring letters of correspondence that required copying to his study in the mornings, where his own secretary was occupied. She understood this for what it was, a constructed proximity, a reason for her presence in a room that did not otherwise hold her. She copied correspondence, and he read dispatches, and on some mornings they did not speak, and on other mornings he asked her a question about her village, about her father who had been a schoolmaster, about what she had read, and listened to the answer with the same quality of full attention he gave to everything. She learned in those mornings that his wife had been named Charlotte, and that the infant had lived only 3 days, and that he had not spoken of either of them to anyone at Asheville since the first year of his mourning. She learned this not because he told her directly, but because he spoke of Charlotte sideways, in references and deflections, and she had enough practice in listening to incomplete sentences to understand the shape of what was missing from each of them. She had seen the portrait. It hung in the small gallery off the morning room, a painting of a fair-haired woman in a blue dress, not much older than Nora herself, with a direct and pleasant expression and the particular quality of composure that suggested a woman who had known, from very young, exactly what was expected of her, and had met it without complaint. Nora had stopped before it once, in the weeks after the morning study conversations had begun, and had stood there for longer than she intended, and then had walked on. She understood that the Duke was not a man who moved quickly toward anything. He had learned, she thought, that quick motion and careless confidence had costs that did not always present themselves immediately. He had learned to be measured, to wait, to look thoroughly before concluding. These were the habits of a man who had been wrong once about something that mattered and had not forgiven himself for the lapse. She did not press him. She brought him, one morning, a letter she had written to her father's solicitor regarding the small estate her father had left. The matter of a modest inheritance tied up in the kind of procedural delay that required someone to ask the right question clearly. She had been attempting to write this letter for 2 years. She showed it to him not because she expected his help, but because she had run out of ways to phrase the central question without making it sound like a grievance, and she had noticed over weeks that he had a particular gift for saying the necessary thing in the smallest number of words. He read it, made 2 small revisions in the margin. "Send this," he said. She sent it. The solicitor replied within the fortnight. The estate was released within 6 weeks, modest and sufficient. And hers, a thing she had stopped believing would happen. "Thank you," she said on the morning after the final papers arrived. "It was your letter," he said. "I only found the word." There was one morning in November when the light was very low and she had been copying for 2 hours and her hand had cramped, and she set the pen down without thinking and pressed her palm flat against the warm stone of the window ledge to ease it. When she looked up, he was watching her. With that expression she had by now catalogued, but still could not name with any word she trusted. "Nora," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his voice, level and particular, stopped her breath for a full count. She waited. "I would like to ask you something that requires a direct answer. And I would like you to know, before I ask it, that the answer, whatever it is, will not alter anything between us." She looked at him. "Do you wish to remain in this house as my wife, or would you prefer to remove to your own estate and be done with all of it?" The fire spoke in the grate. Outside, the November park was bare and gray and beautiful. She thought about the correct answer for perhaps 3 seconds before she understood that she had known it since October. "Your wife," she said. He held her gaze across the room for a moment that carried more weight than a room ought to be able to hold. "Good," he said, and she heard the same quietness in the word as she had heard in the corridor in October. The thing that was not indifference. The opposite of indifference. Then he rose from his desk and crossed the study and offered her his hand, his right hand, and she set her own in it, and his fingers closed over hers with a care that was its own species of declaration. There were 2 people in the room when Lord Fenwick's solicitor delivered his formal letter of withdrawal from the estate's competing trust claim at an afternoon gathering of several senior members of the Ashvale household in the 2nd week of December. Nora stood at the Duke's right hand, wearing a gray merino gown that was not borrowed and had no history of mending. Mrs. Ames was there, and the solicitor Hewell, and 3 other men whose names she had learned over the course of the autumn. She was aware, in that room, of being looked at. Not in the way she had been looked at in the Ashvale dining room for 2 years, that particular not looking of the socially skilled, the practiced absence of attention that was its own species of verdict. This was different. Mrs. Ames looked at her with the careful evaluation of a woman recalculating something she had thought she understood. Hewell did not look at her directly, which she respected. The 3 other gentlemen looked at her with an uncertainty that would resolve itself, she understood, into whatever the Duke's manner toward her indicated they should feel. She stood still. She kept her hands loose at her sides. She had stood in a great many rooms in which other people decided what she was, and she had learned that the most useful response to this particular experience was to give it nothing it could use. The letter was read aloud by Hewell. When he finished, the Duke said simply, "Thank you." And that was all. Later, after the others had left, Mrs. Ames remained for a moment at the door. She looked at Nora with the evaluating thoroughness of 20 years, and then she said, with a briskness that did not entirely conceal what lay beneath it, "I did tell you to be careful." "You did," Nora agreed. "I see it did not answer," Mrs. Ames said, and she left the room, and the sound she made closing the door was not quite loud enough to conceal the other sound, the one that might have been, if one were not careful, something very like relief. They were married on the 3rd Saturday of January in the Ashvale chapel, in the presence of the household and a small number of the Duke's oldest acquaintances. The morning was cold and clear, with the particular quality of stillness that comes after hard frost, when the air is sharp and the world has a defined edge. She had dressed without a maid by choice, because she had always dressed herself, and because the process of doing so gave her a few minutes of useful quiet. She had looked at herself once in the glass, without ceremony, and found that she appeared much as she always appeared. The same dark hair, the same red-knuckled hands, the same direct gaze that had unnerved 3 different housekeepers and apparently not unnerved this particular Duke at all. She was not a different woman for the day. She was herself, more completely than she had been in some time. Her dress was cream wool, simply made, with no ornament except a sprig of winter greenery at the waist that he had selected himself from the estate's glasshouse and presented to her at the door of the chapel without explaining why. She knew why. She had found in the drawer of his desk in October a small pressed cutting of the same plant, brittle with age, tucked inside the cover of the Household Accounts Journal. She had replaced it without comment. She had not needed to ask. The service was brief and correct. When the vicar reached the moment of confirmation, the Duke turned to her with the full, unguarded version of that expression she had spent months cataloging, the one that had no word she trusted, and she understood, looking at it, that she had been wrong about there being no word. There was a word. She had simply not allowed herself to use it until now. He said her name once, quietly, before the final blessing. Just her name. Just that. In the evenings after the wedding, when the house had settled into its winter quiet and the fires in the upstairs rooms had been banked for the night, she sometimes sat at the small writing desk in what was now her sitting room and listened to the sound of ashvale around her, the creak and settle of the old stone, the wind in the oaks along the drive, the occasional soft voice of a servant in the corridor below. She was no longer invisible. She was not certain she had ever fully understood what that would feel like, and she found that it felt less like triumph than like warmth. The specific warmth of a room that has been cold for a long time, and has only now, slowly, over many ordinary mornings, been brought back to what it always should have been. On a night in February, the snow came late and heavy, and she stood at the sitting room window watching it fall through the darkness onto the park below. The fire behind her was warm on her back. She held in her hands the letter from her father's solicitor, the final one, confirming the last of what had been his, now hers. Properly, and without further dispute. She heard him stop in the doorway behind her. She did not turn. "The East Drive will need attention in the morning," he said, his voice carrying the dry thread of practicality that she had come to love. "Yes," she said. He came to stand beside her at the window. They looked out together at the falling snow, the copper oaks gone white, the stone walls of ashvale holding the cold quietly at bay. She folded the letter and held it loosely in her hands. He did not say anything else. Neither did she. The fire was warm. The snow came down in long, soft curtains across the park. Through the dark glass, the world outside was white and still and entirely new. If Nora's story has stayed with you, leave a word in the comments. It means more than you know, and there are more stories here worth finding.